Let me just ask you about some possible criticisms of Bitcoin.
Mhm.
So on centralization, so there's a criticism on the mining and on the node side, or the node is not really the criticism, but Bitcoin mining is not fully decentralized because a small number of miners control a majority of the hashing power. I looked it up. There's 10,000, 15,000, whatever the number is, of computers that are full nodes, that have the full, that are actively connected to the network. So you could argue that's decentralized because it's global, it's all across the world. But the miners, they're still, it's more centralized. So if you're thinking of making a case for Bitcoin being decentralized, do you worry about the miners being somewhat centralized? Is the nodes the important thing to think about?
Yeah.
And what number of nodes counts as centralized and not?
The nodes are what matters because the nodes are what determines Bitcoin's consensus parameters. I think the best way to think about it is that miners simply sell a commodity to the nodes, and that commodity is Bitcoin blocks. So what a miner does is they solve the proof of work problem. So they keep operating their computers until they can get a solution to the problem. And then they attach that to a bunch of transactions and present it to the nodes for the nodes to ratify and approve it. So therefore, I strongly recommend people learn about the 2017 block size war to understand why miners don't control Bitcoin. I discussed this briefly in my Bitcoin Standard, but there's a recent book that discusses this in detail called The Block Size War by Jonathan Beer. It's a great description of, in 2017, essentially the miners thought that they could control Bitcoin. There was one mining company that produced the majority of the machines that were on the network, and they and their allies had a control of the machines that were out there, and they controlled the majority of the hash rate. And they thought that they could change Bitcoin's they could change Bitcoin's block size, which is a tiny little detail, technical parameter. It's not even all that big of a deal for the economics of it. But they thought that they could pass this change. They could force this change on the network. And the members of the network rejected it, and they weren't able to do it. So the nodes are what is sovereign. The nodes are what determine the rules of the game. The miners are a service provider. The miners invest capital up front. They buy the machines, they buy the electricity, they buy the storage, they buy the locations, they pay the rent, and they invest all of that money based on the idea that if they behave according to what the nodes want, the nodes will reward them with Bitcoin. So the miners are in no position to dictate terms for anyone. They've put up their capital up front, and they will only recoup it if they do what the nodes want. So therefore, what really matters is the decentralization of the nodes. So you want to have as many nodes as possible. You want to have a system where there's a large number of nodes, and this is of course the biggest problem with other digital currencies is that because basically Bitcoin has cornered the market on a digital currency. The only way that you can really get traction is to generate a whole bunch of buzzwords about we're doing this and we're doing that, and so other digital currencies are optimized for bells and whistles and buzzwords, and that means adding a computational load, which makes the nodes bigger, harder to operate, and therefore you have a very small number of nodes. In fact, very few digital currencies are keen to publicize how many nodes there are, and they don't have full nodes in the true sense, and it doesn't even matter how many nodes they have because de facto, you can spin up 1 million nodes tomorrow on AWS. Doesn't really matter. What matters is de facto, do the nodes dictate the rules of consensus? And the fact that with most digital currencies you can have hard forks very frequently and they can change the supply all the time means that there's a small group of people who agree amongst themselves how to move forward.